Hi folks, it's Academy Award season, and I have an envelope here, but it's not an envelope for Best Picture. It is an envelope that Sheaffer created over 60 years ago. It is still sealed, and I am going to open it up for the first time on this video, and we will see what's inside. Could this be yet another disappointment like the famous 1986 opening of Al Capone's safe, or will it be the unleashing of the Kraken? My guess is there's going to be a pen inside, and I am going to try that pen and see if it still writes and see what else is in this interesting package that Sheaffer made so long ago. So here it is. This is the not the actual pen, but a similar pen to the pen that I used as a student in the 1970s. It was the beginning of my interest, I guess, in fountain pens, although at that point I wasn't quite so crazy and passionate about it. What's amazing, even back then when this was sold, it was only $1. It was a special, and of course this was one of those examples in American capitalism where they give you the pen practically for free because they want you to buy the cartridges. And this is the so-called Sheaffer student pen, but in fact it really didn't have that name. For most of its history, it seems not to have had a name at all, and people wonder what should it be called. At one point they called a lot of different Sheaffer pens the Sheaffer People's Pen. That was a kind of 1970s 1980s idea, late 70s and 80s idea, the People's Pen. You can see that these would hang in a stationery store from this little hole. Later these were sold at Staples on into the 90s. I have I think this is another 80s version of it. You can tell by the price. I keep showing it upside down. So this would be 80s, $1.49. And then I have a very late version, I think, from the 90s. I'm not sure, this doesn't have a price on it, but probably would have been more like $4, $5, $6. I'm not sure how high the price went before they stopped making these cartridge pens. I talk about this a year ago. I did a whole discussion of the pen, and I was pleased by how many people seemed to watch that video. It really sort of struck a chord with a lot of people because they too started using fountain pens in the 60s and 70s. And actually the Sheaffer cartridge pen goes all the way back to the late 50s, and it was for many people their first pen. One of those people who contacted me fairly recently was Jeff Richards. Like me, he was somewhat frustrated that a pen that was so popular that Sheaffer claimed in the late 50s that they had sold over 8 million of these pens between 1955, when they first introduced it, before 1960, 8 million pens were sold. That's extraordinary for a fountain pen, keeping in mind that it was in the 50s that the ballpoint pen really takes off and people are beginning to move away from fountain pens. So the cartridge fountain pen, which is what these pens use, is really what kept the fountain pen going because it meant that there was no mess. Sheaffer would say that you could load one of these pens. Where's an early version of it? Here's an early package version of it, that you could load one of these pens with the ease of how you could load a bullet into a rifle. I'm not even sure that that's that easy, but they compared it to that. And of course, when you had a cartridge in here, it meant no mess. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so popular with high school students. I'm not sure why in the 1970s, when I was using it, that suddenly all my friends were using these pens or seemed to be using using it. I think it had something to do, however, with the nostalgia boom that was going on in the early 70s. People were going to old Hollywood movies. I was going to old Hollywood movies. In the late 60s, people were kind of obsessed with Victoriana, and they were obsessed with Art Nouveau in the beginning of the 20th century. So that might have been part of it. And I think a very obvious thing is that kids liked using different colors. And Sheaffer had this beautiful peacock blue. It was kind of turquoise color. That was everybody's favorite color. A lot of people also liked to write with purple. And it was just a step up from using a pen that wasn't a Bic. You know, everybody in school were using these Bic pens. I read somewhere that the Bic pen, the stick pen, was the most successful industrial design in history, that they sold so many of those pens, and people would use those pens and just kind of throw away or lose them. The fountain pens seemed to be something that was cooler, I think, and more fun. This is one of the ones that I would have probably used, this model. The model changed from the 1950s on in subtle ways. This one from the 70s has a kind of pointy top. Of course, they all have very similar nibs. You could get it in fine and medium, and then it has a kind of pointy bottom. But the thing that I think people love so much about these pens is that they were translucent, so you could see the ink inside, which is brilliant, because then you knew when you needed a new cartridge, which is a real problem in school. You don't want to run out of ink, and this way you always knew how much ink you had. It also was very satisfying because you just fit in one of those plastic cartridges and kind of pushed it in, and then you closed it up. And also it was designed in such a way that it was kind of tight. So even if you didn't push it in completely, once you closed the pen, the cartridge went in, and then you could kind of watch the ink go up and down. And that was very satisfying. I think they're really beautiful to look at. Now, vintage pen people are not so excited by pens like this. First of all, there's so many of them. They're not very expensive. The other thing is that some people feel that the introduction of the cartridge, which actually they had cartridges all the way back from the beginning of the 20th century, and maybe even the late 19th century, they had glass cartridges, but they didn't really take off until the 50s. Anyway, they kind of feel that the introduction of the cartridge and what goes along with it, the converter, is the end of the era of the great vintage pen, the sort of golden years of what a fountain pen should be. But that doesn't really make sense, since after the 1950s, they've made all kinds of wonderful pens. And I don't think it makes sense because I actually think that this design is a very beautiful, sleek, elegant design. So if you're interested in the aesthetics of a pen and the way it looks, then I don't think you can fault this particular pen. Now, in terms of the way it writes, it was very reliable, almost indestructible. When you find these pens in flea markets or on eBay for $15, $20 or even less, you'll find that they almost all write perfectly fine. I think that has something to do with the fact that they only used Sheaffer cartridges, so the ink was perfectly formulated for them and didn't ruin them. And they just made really good, strong steel nibs. But the nibs themselves write very reliably, and I think particularly the medium writes relatively well. But there's nothing exciting about them. They certainly aren't flexy. They don't flex at all. They are like nails, I suppose, if you want to think. But I think that's fine. I'm not someone who feels that I need to draw necessarily with a flex nib, and they certainly wrote very, very well. I will throw this out here, since I'm the curator of the Sendak Foundation, that Maurice Sendak used one of these pens when he wrote letters and sometimes did little doodles. He didn't use them to actually draw his famous books. He used dip pens for that, but he did use these often when he signed a book. So lots and lots of people use these pens. Anyway, when I did that video, I got some really great responses. And recently I got a response from Jeff Richards, and he wrote me a very long and elaborate piece about all the research that he had done on the Sheaffer pen, and that he'd been using them since the 1950s, and he had really found out all this information about the very early period in which the pen is first developed. I have his permission to use that information in this video. I'm sure that I'm going to get things mixed up, and that's not his fault, because all the details can be quite complicated or subtle in terms of the different changes that happen, particularly in the very introduction of the cartridge pen. The interesting thing about the pen is that it starts out being a production of Sheaffer's fine line division, and the fine line division was somewhat less expensive, tended to be pens that have steel nibs, and the first cartridge pen that Sheaffer introduces is in 1955. I think one of the reasons that might be for that is that Sheaffer had spent so much money promoting their snorkel pen, and that was something that was a really wonderful and fascinating invention. They'd advertised that using Ethel from I Love Lucy, and I think that the whole point of the snorkel pen was that it's supposed to make it so harder to mess your hands up and make it easier to get ink into the pen. And the cartridge, I think, obviously made that much easier. Anyway, it first comes out as a fine line pen. It says on it and in the advertising that it is fine line by Sheaffer, so people are well aware of that. This is the pen and pencil set. The one thing you'll notice that's different is that these are not the original cartridges. The original cartridge had a yellow end and a clear end, and that helped you know which end to put into the pen. So here are the instructions that came with the pen, and it says here, you insert the script refill in the barrel with the yellow end first. It's interesting to me that they use the word barrel because part of their advertising campaign is that you put these cartridges like you would a bullet into the barrel of a gun. They actually use that as a reference. One of the things I thought was interesting about this is that it has this thing about emergency refilling, and it says, if new cartridge is not readily available, an empty cartridge may be partially filled by unscrewing the barrel, immersing writing powder in available ink supply, and lightly squeezing empty cartridge. In other words, when you do that with an ink pen, then the cartridge becomes something like a converter when you squeeze it. It must have been, these earlier cartridges must have been considerably softer than later versions of the cartridge, because it's kind of hard to squeeze the later versions. And of course, if you do that, you're kind of defeating the whole point of the cartridge pen if you start dipping the pen in. So that's a funny idea. I suppose that's because in the beginning, when these pens were first introduced, the cartridges were not so easily available. So from that standpoint, that makes sense, I think. And here it is with the guarantee for the pen. Now, according to Jeff, and this is around when he starts using the pens in 1958, they switch over to Sheaffer's regular pens. I have some of these early versions. Okay, here is a group of the pens from the 1950s to the 1990s. If you Google the Sheaffer student pen, what you're probably going to find out, as I did a year ago, is that people claim that there are three versions of the pen. The torpedo version, the diamond sort of pointed on each end. If you can see that, it has a kind of diamond shape here on each end. And then the final version, which is flat top on the bottom and the top. You'll notice that these two earlier versions have these lines on the chrome cap, and that when they do the final version, it's all very simplified. Now, Jeff Richards wants us to know that that's not actually the case, that when the pen was being made in the 1950s, that they had this earlier version with the band in the middle, which is, I think, quite nice. I think that this is a little bit narrower than the later versions. And the other thing that he wants us to know, which is really interesting, is that they did this two-tone version, that some people think, oh, this must be a Franken pen, that people are taking two different color pens and putting it together. But no, he remembers going to the stationery store or the drugstore, and that they had a display of these two-tone version pens. And he points out how these relate to a lot of the design colors that were going on in the late 50s in terms of car design, etc. So really, there are four versions, or you could argue five versions of the pen, and you really should add yet another version, which is the very first version of the pen. This is the fine line version that came out in 1955. Another change, and I'm not going to go into all that, is with the clip. There is subtle changes. I think you can see that this is a much more substantial clip on the fine line version, heavier metal. And the logos change as it goes along. Of course, the biggest change goes from fine line to Sheaffer's, and then in the 1960s, they dropped the S, and the logo becomes just Sheaffer. But even then, they changed the logo from time to time, it seems. So there are different versions in that way. Now, usually, a lot of times in these narratives, there's a kind of sense in which the pen gets cheaper and less well designed as it goes along. Now, that might be, it's true certainly in terms of materials, but in terms of the design, I think that the final design is less fussy. I like it, and just the simplicity of the flat top and the bottom and the top. I think it's a much more clearer, more modernist design. The materials of the pen, as they try to make it less and less expensive and try to keep the price down to as close as $1 as they can, get much cheaper, particularly like the band. I don't know if you can see this, but the band is really quite inexpensive. And has these, I remember using these pens, and you had a tendency to lose this little band. It'll just fall out. Another thing that's cool about these pens is that for whatever reason, I guess the laws back then, they didn't insist that they put a hole in the bottom of the pen as they do for a lot of pens that are geared towards young people. And so with silicone, you can eyedropper these pens fairly successfully. I mean, they're different. There are people online who explain how to do that. I mean, it may require getting some kind of an O-ring to do that, or use silicone around the end, but you could fill these with ink that way if you like to eyedropper pens, which I don't particularly like to do, but that's one possible advantage of actually all these versions of the pen that were made from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so that, I think, is a more balanced view, or a more extensive view. Again, thanks to Jeff Richards for pointing this out, that there are all these different versions. the pen to make things even more complicated, I suppose. Let me make the point that the term Skripsert was a term that Sheaffer used for a whole range of cartridge pens. For example, I think I'm going to do a whole video about them, but they were a beautiful series of lady Sheaffer pens, and they have these conical nibs. So just because it was a cartridge pen or a Skripsert pen didn't mean necessarily that it was a student pen or geared towards students. And then there is some issue about what defines a student pen. Could it be that if you have one of those conical nibs like this, let's say, would that make this still a student pen? There are also pens that they were making that have embedded points. So you could say that those were also student pens. I feel that the pens that have this type of nib, the 304, originally it was called the 304 and the 305, and then later fine and medium, it would just say F and M. Those are the pens that should be called student pens or Skripsert pens for students, and that the other pens really are a different line or should be talked about in a different way. One of the other things that I found on eBay recently is this pen that I assume was a salesperson's sample pen that you would get back in the day. What you can see here is the different prices that you pay depending on how many pens you get. If you get 100, then each pen is $1. If you buy 5,000, the pen becomes 75 cents. And it also says that you get in an assortment of 25% black, 25% assorted colors, and you'll get fine or medium points in the different pens that you get depending on how many you buy. So that's kind of neat to have the salesperson's pen. Well, now we've come to the climax of this whole thing. In this whole process, I sent away for one of these packs. Now, Jeff talks about how in the late 50s, he would come to the supermarket and there would be a whole a basket filled with dozens and dozens of these handwriting kits. And it is from that moment on, really, that this pen gets identified as a student pen. Remember, when it's first introduced, and you can see that in the advertisement for the fine line pen, it's not aimed at students. It's not that cheap. But by the end of the 50s, they had figured out a way to make the pen much less expensive. And they say here that the regular price is $2.95, but they're actually giving you the pen for free, and they're paying for the ink. And by the time you got $3.44, well, they would sell this for $1. So not only did you get a pen, but you get other stuff in this envelope that you could pick up, and it was aimed at students. And one could imagine that they did this near high schools and colleges, etc. And I guess somebody out there has come upon a whole bunch of these that are still in their pristine envelopes and are selling them on eBay. And so I'm going to open one of these up. I hope that it's not like Pandora's box and vile things will come out. I suppose I could steam this open, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to... It wasn't that expensive. So here it comes. Spilling it out. Let's see what we have here. Well, it comes with instructions. We can see on the instructions, by the way, that it has the date 857 358, which I think means that it probably was made in 57, but it's sold into 58. and it has instructions for their pencil. There's a guide here about how to be a better writer. Now, who wouldn't want to be a better writer? And it's a booklet to help you improve your writing. Interestingly enough, on the cover is not one of the pens that we've been talking about. And then there's a little package of ink. And then there's a pen in this clear plastic, and it says Sheaffer's on it, not fine line. Now let's look at the cartridges. I would doubt it that there would still be ink in them, but I'm curious to see if at that point they were using the yellow. I don't think so. No, and you can see they've dried out, so I surely cannot use the ink that came in here because there's no ink. And you'll notice that by this point, they now have a cartridge where you could use either end. That made it a little bit easier. Now, there's one exciting thing about this. There's no cache in here or secret messages as far as I know, but there is one crucial fact. It says genuine Sheaffer's Skripsert fountain pen. So what we've discovered is that this pen really does have a name. Its name is a Skripsert. That's the name that they used. However, I would say that's a terrible name. They did use that name for a number of their pens at the time. So you could say, well, it's not exclusive to this pen. But the main point is it was never called a student pen. It was called the Skripsert pen. Maybe a model that was, aimed at students. And somehow or other that name kind of disappeared. The name, in a sense, emphasizes the idea that what they're trying to sell are cartridges because the cartridges are called Skrip, S-K-R-I-P cartridges, and they want you to use those cartridges. And here is a little booklet on how you should write and how your handwriting to improve your handwriting, which is nice. It says, writing is like breathing, eating, and sleeping. You do it every day. Well, you don't really need a guide to how to breathe, eat, and sleep, so it's a little odd to say that that's what it's like. But we also have a little message from the Sheaffer Pen Company and all this things about what kind of paper to use, and of course you need to use these particular cartridges. So, isn't that exciting? The strangest thing about all this is the fact that they give you this pen. They have a pen that is more like this pen on the front. And that doesn't really make too much sense, but probably means that they use this booklet in other contexts with other pens. Well, I think the next thing to do is to see if this pen will actually write. Okay, here I go. This is the 304, which would be a fine. And this is a modern or contemporary Sheaffer cartridge. They no longer call it Skrip. And this is rhodia paper. Okay, so this would be from 1958. That means that it is 67 years old pen, and it writes perfectly, as if it were brand new. No problem. No flex to it at all, of course. But it's pleasant writer. It's not super smooth, but it's also not very rough. And keeping in mind that it is, I mean, it's not extra fine, but it's fine to medium. I think this would be considered a Japanese fine. Look at how well it, it absolutely consistent writer. I mean, this is what I use to sketch. I did all my earliest sketchbooks with pens like this. I really like the fact that the ink was washable, meaning that it wasn't waterproof. Because I like to color things in and blend them in. And that's kind of amazing. This is still a great pen. It has lasted a long time. If you found this video useful, please subscribe and give it a like. It doesn't cost you any money to subscribe, and it's a great way to support the channel.